Papers, please. Purpose of your visit?
Purpose of my visit? To talk about a vest nobody asked for, but everybody should know about. Greetings, comrades! Today we finally turn to a topic long overdue on this channel: Soviet body armor. And for this episode I actually have something special to show you. This here is the Soviet ZhZL-74 armored vest. And surprisingly there is almost no real information about this piece of gear on YouTube, so we will take the matter into our own hands and do our best to explore what this is, why it was made, and the unexpected role it played during the final years of the Soviet Union. Давай, let's go, I'll show you. The ZhZL is not actually a ballistic vest. It was designed to protect against thrust from sharp objects and blunt force. There is no definitive information on the name, but most likely the acronym ZhZL, or ZhZL in Cyrillic, stands for Жилет защитный легкий, which literally translates to Vest Protective Light in English. The original acronym has 3 letters instead of 4 because ZH is a single letter in the Russian alphabet, similar to abbreviations like PPSH or DSHK. The number 74 most likely refers to the year of adoption, 1974, when the vest was introduced into service by the Soviet Interior Ministry, or MVD. This way the ZhZL-74 became the second armored vest out of the only 2 ever created for Soviet law enforcement, following the ZhZT-71. Prior to this, personal protection for militia or any other MVD unit was not a priority due to the lack of real threats. Violence in the USSR during this period, or even throughout the 1970s, was comparatively rare, especially against law enforcement, and incidents of civil unrest or disturbances where such protection would be necessary were even more uncommon, to put it euphemistically. But don't worry, the upcoming decade would change that with a few strokes of a pen. For now, let's take a closer look at the vest itself. At first glance it appears quite rudimentary, but I promise you that the most interesting part is actually inside. Externally, the vest is composed of 2 panels, a smaller front panel and a larger back panel. Both are what appears to be nylon or mixed fabric covers. The inner face of each panel is lined with stitched padding that strongly resembles a medieval gambeson worn under plate armor, which is not a coincidence. The panels are actually held together only by Velcro closures, 2 lines on each shoulder. It might seem insufficient, yet given how light the vest is, it seems to work. And to be fair, the Velcro is also surprisingly solid for something produced half a century ago. It might not look like much, but trust me, this Velcro is stronger than most Western marriages. Speaking of Velcro, there's a rumor that Czechoslovakia began manufacturing it earlier than the USSR, and exported much of it to the Soviet Union. As a result, some Soviet gear may allegedly contain Czechoslovak Velcro, although this is not something I can confirm. In the absence of a traditional cummerbund, the vest is fastened at the abdomen with 2 straps, an internal one that connects beneath the front panel, and an external one that goes over it, resembling a belt stitched to the back panel. This way the frontal section is firmly held in place. The vest was originally issued with a canvas bag for storage and transportation, as well as an individual item passport. Unfortunately, neither of these survives with this specimen. Both panels are stamped on the inside along the lower edge with factory markings that include the item designation, ZhZL-74, a serial number, and what are most likely quality control or manufacturer's marks. Interestingly, the panels on this example are mismatched, indicating that it was assembled from parts of 2 different vests for reasons that remain unknown. Adding to the intrigue, it also bears some unusual unit markings. In case you're interested, I will return to the story of this particular ZhZL closer to the end of the video. As always, a lot of research and time goes into making these videos and sourcing original items, so if you'd like to support the work and gain early access to our content, links to Boosty and Patreon are down below. Since the panels are sealed from the factory, there is no way to look inside without cutting them open, which of course we're not going to do. Fortunately, plenty of images of the internal structure are available. Both panels consist of reinforced fabric screens, sandwiched between a series of identical metallic discs, forming something very close to ancient lamellar plates or dragon scales. This is basically 14th century armor but optimized for the 1970s Soviet budget. The discs are riveted in pairs through the fabric in an overlapping roof-tile pattern, making it impossible to slip an owl or a spike underneath from any protected angle. At the same time, the segments can shift and bend relatively freely in all directions, giving the panels a notable degree of flexibility. The rear panel is larger than the front one and also incorporates flaps for side protection. The vest comes in at a total of 3.4 kilograms, or about 7.5 pounds. And you may be asking yourself, how can it be so light if there is so much metal inside? And that would be a fair question. Of course, the plates used in the ZhZL-74 are not steel, otherwise the user's spine would collapse like the Moldovan economy. Instead, the vest uses a fairly sophisticated aluminum alloy designated ABT-101, originally developed for light armored vehicles such as the Soviet BMD series. Each individual tile is 2 mm thick and 50 mm in diameter, with the entire assembly protecting a total area of about 45 decimeters squared. The vest covers all vital organs of the abdomen and generally provides solid protection of the core against knives, shanks, spikes, and other thrusting weapons. It also significantly softens the blunt impact of thrown stones, clubs, crowbars, or even axes. As I mentioned earlier, the ZhZL-74 is not a ballistic vest, yet it would likely be capable of stopping minor fragmentation, small shrapnel, and perhaps even birdshot in theory. It is important to note that during the time of its introduction, the vest was not meant for daily use by the militia. There was simply no operational need for routine individual protection for the lack of a persistent and credible threat. Instead, these vests were kept in storage and issued only for serious incidents or in scenarios where a high likelihood of violence was indeed anticipated. But even in such cases, the primary concern was non-ballistic protection, because firearm-related violence was comparatively non-existent until the disturbances of late Soviet and early post-Soviet periods. Despite its large surface area, it is surprisingly not excessively bulky to wear. Thanks to the flexibility of the individual elements, it does not restrict movement too much, unless you try to tie your shoes. Another point of discomfort is the collar, where the edges can dig into your neck if you're not wearing it over uniform or some other layer. As far as I know, the vest was produced in a single universal size, and adjustment is limited to the different positions available on both the internal and external waist straps, and perhaps to some extent the velcro closures on the shoulders. The vest itself has no load-bearing capability and was not designed to be worn with a belt over it, as it was the case with Soviet military body armor of the time. There was no intended way of using it with additional equipment. However, if the need arises, the external waist strap can definitely be used as a mounting point for standard Soviet pouches, a bayonet, or other desired equipment. In fact, this is precisely how the ZhZL-74 appears to have been employed in this reference photograph from the Transnistrian conflict of 1992. The image shows servicemen manning an improvised checkpoint, likely observing an opposing one, whose occupants are in all probability wearing something very similar, almost like looking into a mirror. At this point, to better understand the conditions in which the ZhZL-74 saw widespread use, it makes sense to take a step back and explain how we arrived here. Beginning in 1985, a series of political and economic reforms initiated under General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev fundamentally altered the structure of the Soviet state. Known as Perestroika, the Russian term for reconstruction, these measures were intended to modernize and improve the existing system. In practice, however, they weakened executive government and disrupted the established economic networks, triggering a deep crisis and creating artificial shortages of basic commodities. By the late 1980s, this erosion of authority began to manifest in a growing number of regional conflicts. Against the backdrop of economic collapse, the resulting ideological vacuum was increasingly filled in by rising nationalism, religious radicalism, and the private interests of local elites, replacing those of the central government. With few effective restraints remaining, ethnic and political tensions escalated into open violence across multiple regions of the country, conditions that finally gave limelight to the ZhZL-74. The first major flashpoint emerged in Nagorno-Karabakh in 1988, a region where Armenians and Azerbaijanis had previously coexisted in relative peace. Disputes over the region's status, fueled by rising nationalist sentiment in both republics, escalated into violent confrontations, pogroms, and mass unrest. Amid increasingly ineffective attempts by the central government to contain the instability and prevent large-scale bloodshed, internal forces and other MVD units were dispatched to the region in an effort to restore order. Abkhazia soon followed in 1989, where local calls for greater autonomy, combined with rapidly rising Georgian nationalism, produced a similar outcome, triggering violent confrontations and widespread unrest. Once again, internal forces were deployed to suppress the violence. A comparable situation unfolded in Fergana, Uzbekistan, where ethnic violence erupted between the Uzbek population and the local Turkish minority. By 1990, unrest and outright violence had spread to Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and numerous other regions. Notably, in all of these cases, a significant portion of the deployed personnel was equipped with ZhZL-74 body armor, alongside other ride control equipment, including the Sfera helmet. For most of its service life, the ZhZL functioned as contingency equipment, designed for situations that officially were never supposed to occur. Scenes like this would have been unimaginable in 1980, yet by 1990 they were almost ordinary. Firearms remained relatively rare. Much of the violence was close, improvised and personal. Knives, clubs, bricks and shanks. These are precisely the kinds of threats the ZhZL-74 had been designed to counter. The vest finally found its purpose, issued to units operating in an environment where the old rules had collapsed faster than new ones could be written. In 1991, 6 men met at a dacha deep in the forests of Belarus. Few outside that room knew it was happening, and even fewer understood the consequences. Those present were the leaders of the Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet republics. As the largest and the only remaining founding members of the USSR, they exploited their position, the impotence of the Central Soviet Authority, and the political chaos unleashed by Perestroika to effectively pull the trigger on the country itself, accomplishing what decades of external pressure had failed to achieve. The decision stunned not only the citizens of the USSR, who had overwhelmingly voted to preserve the Union just a few months earlier, but also then President Mikhail Gorbachev, who was never informed of the meeting and was abruptly left without a country. And even here, the vest found its place. This photo depicts personnel of the newly formed OMON unit of the MVD, partially equipped with ZhZL-74 vests, guarding a polling station during the aforementioned Union-wide referendum in the Transnistrian region of the Moldavian SSR, a region that would descend into civil war by 1992, just one short year later. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not merely the end of a state. It was the removal of an entire system of control, ideology and predictability. What replaced it, in many places, was nothing at all, a vacuum ready to be exploited. The newly formed states, above all the Russian Federation itself, were suddenly open to rapid privatization. A previously planned economy became, as Russians would say, an unplowed field, an unprecedented opportunity for private capital. And the faster the remnants of the old government could be dismantled, the faster money could be made. By 1993, this contradiction culminated in a political crisis between President Boris Yeltsin, one of the key figures responsible for liquidating the Soviet Union, and his administration on one side, and the Russian Supreme Soviet, led by Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, on the other. Both sides had supporters. Some welcomed the promises of democratic transformations and new economic opportunities, while others opposed what they saw as the dismantling of their country by a narrow oligarchic elite. Violence erupted when Yeltsin signed the unconstitutional Decree 1400, illegally dissolving the parliament, and reached its peak during the events that would become known as Black October 1993, when military units loyal to the president shelled the White House, the Russian parliament building in central Moscow. The confrontation unfolded against the backdrop of shock therapy reforms and uncontrolled privatization, which had already devastated the economy, erased personal savings, and driven mass impoverishment. These developments sparked civil unrest on multiple occasions. Naturally, MVD units were deployed once again, equipped with the ZhZL-74. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, attempts to contain the violence faded, and much of what had once been described as civil unrest in many regions of the former USSR escalated into full-scale civil war. Artillery, tanks, and military-grade firearms entered the picture, rendering the ZhZL largely ineffective. Although a number of complex and debatable episodes would occasionally place the vest back into its intended role, by the mid-1990s it had largely disappeared from service. However, the deep analysis of those events falls outside the scope of this video, and frankly beyond the scope of this channel. It is hard to tell with certainty what role our vest played amid those chaotic and tragic events. But one thing is for sure, it didn't simply sit around in some forgotten warehouse collecting dust. As evidenced by the mismatched serial numbers, it is not even a single vest technically, but rather a composite put together out of two different ones. This particular specimen likely originates somewhere from Ukraine, or at least that is where it entered our collection from, quite a few years ago. The seller briefly mentioned the possibility of it being used either by the internal forces of the MVD or the Ukrainian National Guard somewhere in the 1990s, in the item description. And it is likely that these white stripes that come across as unit markings or some sort of other identification have something to do with that. But beyond educated guesswork, we do not have any reason to believe that's claim to be true. Regardless of what one thinks of the historical and political context surrounding this vest, I think it is hard to argue that it is a relatively unique piece of gear with a design that strongly stands out among its contemporary counterparts, especially those within Soviet service. And I hope that in this video we managed to shed at least a little bit of light on this otherwise commonly forgotten and overlooked item. And please let us know if you enjoyed this format and if you'd like to see more on Soviet body armor. See you in the next video. Давай!
Бабушка лив скет.
Okay, you can pass, but be careful. It's not safe here anymore.